Good afternoon. I think you can hear me resoundingly so. I'm Ian Wardrop, I'm the director of the Frick Collection. Delighted to welcome you all to the Samuel H. Kress Lecture in Museum Education. This is a distinguished series of annual lectures, which we were able to mount thanks to the Kress Foundation. We thank them very much. Fortunately for me, I can keep my remarks brief, as Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, has a high profile running an international social justice philanthropy with a $13 billion endowment. Darren led the philanthropy committee that helped bring a resolution to the city of Detroit's historic bankruptcy, among his many achievements. As a museum director, I'm grateful to him for inspiring the nonprofit institutions to bring forward diversity in their staff, their boards, and their programs. He has given tonight's subject a lot of thought, reimagining New York City's monuments, in his role as co-chair of New York City's Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers. The Frick recently opened the exhibition Canovas, George Washington, reconstructing a lost monument which was erected in the Raleigh, North Carolina State House in 1821, but which burned in a fire less than a decade later. The commission was given to the great Italian sculptor Canova on the suggestion of Thomas Jefferson. And it is notable that the recent controversy over Civil War monuments began in Jefferson's backyard, Charlottesville, Virginia, and spread to New York and other communities across the United States. Joining Darren Walker in conversation is our assistant museum educator for school programs, Rachel Himes. She began here in 2014 as an Aisha Bulkandani intern after receiving a bachelor's in religious studies from Brown and an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design in Brown and RISD's dual design program. I'm delighted to welcome Darren and Rachel.
Great. Well then, Darren, I'm so excited to welcome you and everyone here to the Frick for the Samuel H. Kress Lecture in Museum Education, and for this conversation, which I think many of us gathered here today probably feel is essential in this particular moment, but which also reaches into our past and asks us questions about who we were, who we are, and who we can become. And it's a topic which is, personally important to me as an early career educator who works with New York City students, as a staff member at a cultural institution, the Frick Collection, and also simply as someone who spends time in the public spaces of our city and our nation. And your work as president of the Ford Foundation has been to advance equity, equality, human dignity, while foregrounding these principles of social justice. And I think that's why I and many people were excited to see that you were co-chairing the Mayoral Advisory Commission on city monuments and markers. And sort of, as I started thinking about this topic, what kept coming to me were more and more questions. And so my first question for you is about questions, which I think is appropriate since this is a process of interrogation, of reckoning with our past, and of questioning those monuments that are in our public space. So what are those questions that we must ask ourselves when considering what to do with and how to engage with our public monuments? And here I'm thinking of, those questions that you and the commission developed as you were working on those recommendations, but also questions that educators can ask students and ask themselves when engaging critically with these works of art. What are those questions?
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's such an honor to be in this remarkable jewel called the Frick. What a treat for me. I've always admired this really stunning collection and the beautiful architecture and design of this place and the serenity that it offers you in the midst of the madness of Gotham. So for me, I love this place, and thank you, Ian, for hosting me. And Rika, this is really a huge honor. I had no idea anyone would turn up on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m. when there are all sorts of things you could be doing on a day like today, so I'm really honored. Thank you. The question of questions. I think it is so important to us in this city and in this country to be in a conversation about who we are as a people. And it in this country has been an ongoing discourse that has been contested throughout the history of this country, because who we are has evolved. And that's what's so remarkable about this country, is that our identity as Americans has been porous, unlike most countries in the world. And that has given us an opportunity to continually redefine who we are and to broaden the circle of inclusion of American identity. And when Mayor de Blasio asked me if I would join Tom Finkelpearl in co-chairing the commission, of course, my colleagues at Ford said, "Don't do it, it's a thankless task." And my partner said, "Does this mean you'll be home even less than you already are?" And there were many who might have thought that it wasn't the best idea. But I really saw it as just a tremendous honor and opportunity to serve, because I love this city. And like most New Yorkers, I'm not from New York. And having grown up in the American South, coming to New York was always something that was so remotely possible to me. And so the idea of being here and having that honor was something I felt really compelled to accept. Having done that, I do think that it was a real journey. And it was a journey of learning for me, because the questions that I wanted to understand was, what is the history of identity in New York? Going back to the indigenous New Yorkers, if you will, and understanding what has shaped the narrative of this city over its 3 centuries, and how has that narrative manifest today, and what do we want the narrative of New York City to be into the future? How do we ensure that the circle of inclusion continues to broaden? And how do we ensure that people, all of us, feel validated, uplifted, valorized in our public spaces? Because we see representations of all of us in our very diverse forms. So I learned a lot by asking questions, and by, I think, being, as someone who loves the humanities and the liberal arts, this process for me was great, because one of the things about the arts, as we all know, is that the arts engender empathy. If you really engage in the humanities, you develop a capacity to put yourself in the shoes of other people. And that doesn't mean that, it means that all of us have to be able to do that. It means that me, as a queer black man in New York City, needs to be able to put myself in the shoes of a straight white man in Alabama, and to attempt to understand things from their perspective. And I think on that journey, I learned a lot of things that were very, very new to me. For example, I had conceptions about the Columbus statue. And on the journey, I learned about the history of Italian Americans and their story of becoming American. And on that journey, I learned, for example, something that I did not know, that the largest single lynching in US history was in New Orleans, and it was a lynching of a group of Italian immigrants. I'd always thought that only African Americans were lynched in this country. But I learned through that process that there was a history of violence against Italian immigrants in the 1880s and 90s. And the reason so many Italians were violated was because they weren't seen as Americans. And a group of Italians had the smart idea of appropriating the icon of America, Christopher Columbus. Because if we all know that actually, if you know the history of Italy, most of the Italian immigrants coming to the United States were from Sicily and the poor part in the south of Italy. Columbus and the elites in the north very much did not consider them in the south. There weren't even one country at that time. But they appropriated that image because it allowed them to be American. It gave them currency in the American narrative, and they were desperate to not be marginalized in the American narrative. And by adopting Columbus, they were able to put themselves at the center of the American narrative and not be seen as those dark-skinned Southern Europeans who were looked down upon by the Aryans from the north. And that was very, very important for me to understand that. It did not negate the facts of Columbus's exploits in the United States and the subsequent genocide of Native Americans. And so we have to, as Americans, be able to hold the contradictory narratives and realities of our history and not romanticize them, not treat them as not porous to continued reinterpretation.
Yeah, to me it seems that sort of part of the process of coming to understand monuments has been learning that we can ask questions. Monuments are sort of part of our public space, part of the visual fabric of our cities, and we might not question them. But when we do, what you've sort of shared here is that we get real historical answers that bring nuance and complexity to our relationship with these sort of just objects that are in our space that we encounter on our commutes or just when we are living our lives in the city. And these questions prompt conversations. And this issue of monuments has really, I think, captured our public discourse. I've read a lot of coverage on it. I've had conversations with friends, with family on this topic. And I also noted that when the commission was thinking about what to do about those sort of 5 case study monuments, that there were conversations held in each of the 5 boroughs to make it a public space, people sharing their own thoughts and reactions and ideas. But a common argument that I've seen from people considering what to do or how to engage with monuments, an argument that I've seen for people who want to leave them where they are, as they are, is sort of this idea that monuments provide us all with a learning opportunity, with a space to critically engage with or intellectually grapple with our past and with the figures who populated that past, whether or not we are proud of that past. And I guess the question that this raises for me is, given the desirability of this learning outcome, and we do want to learn from our past, how can we balance the desire to learn with the fact that for many people, encounters with these public monuments are painful because of the trauma that they represent. And I think trauma is a word that can sound maybe overblown here, but I'm talking about a trauma that is historic and generational. And it's a trauma that I think is personal. Like you, I grew up in the South. I grew up in Virginia, although Northern Virginia, so it's debatable whether or not it is the South.
It's the South.
Okay, yeah, I think it's the South. But I do like to say I'm a Southerner. But nevertheless, where I grew up, you could get in the car 5 minutes from my house. You could get on the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway, which was founded in the 19-teens by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And driving on the Jefferson Davis Memorial Highway, you could see from your car the Robert E. Lee Memorial House. And those are just two examples of the types of commemorations that exist, all throughout our nation. And growing up in that area and seeing these figures honored, uncritically again and again and again, just every day, it was wearisome and unsettling and saddening. And so I guess just my question is, what it boils down to is how can we create spaces for learning in and around these monuments, with these monuments, while keeping in mind that they are sources of pain?
Yes. I think that so much of this is about our culture in this country of being challenged to come to grips with our history, because we are all a part of a belief system of exceptionalism that prevents us, the sort of ideology of exceptionalism, ideology of American exceptionalism, prevents us from engaging critically. And I actually, for me, when I engage critically about the American narrative and our history, I'm even more proud of my country and our history. And so I don't fear a critical analysis of American history, of the Civil War. I think that the real crux is that for so many in our country, there is a need to hold on to these narratives that are not based on truth. And we all do that. We do it in our own families. My mother was telling me the other day she made some comment about Uncle Bernie, and she said something, and oh, what a great soul he was. And I said, you used to call him a drunk and where did this narrative come from? What are you talking about? Where did this narrative come from? Well, but now all of a sudden, to hold on to our histories, we manufacture because we so desperately need to believe. And I think it's one of the things about our history that I know as you, as an African American in the South, the iconography of the Confederacy is everywhere. And it is so exalted, so uncritically. And much of it, and this is where I think the ability to discern what should be taken down for me becomes clearer. Much of that iconography was erected in defiance of social progress. So in a city like New Orleans or at the Texas State Capitol, there are statues, plaques, things that were all put up in response to integration, in response to the opening up of the economy, of the benefits of that economy and schools and other things. These were erected. The Southern flags that have the Confederate flag in them were all put there in the 20th century. They were put there in the 20th century to defy intervention by federal government. The organizations that were supporting integration, so much of it was done then. So to my mind, those kinds of monuments really don't deserve to be, to remain. I don't feel, you know, when I was in college in Austin, Texas, I was a tour guide at the state capitol, and in the rotunda there are these medallions that were placed there by the Sons of the Confederacy that explicitly say why the Civil War was fought. And there is no mention of slavery. There is no mention of slavery. And as a tour guide, you walk from one medallion to the next, and you explain this. And so that's the really hard part for me. And again, we all want our heroes to have such virtue that they are unimpeachable. And our heroes were human. And we should celebrate that in their humanity, they were flawed and they were able to rise above their flaws. I was with a group of well-heeled African Americans, and we'd just seen Selma. And a couple of people voiced their disapproval and downright anger at Ava DuVernay's film because she brought to light Dr. King's mistresses. And this person said, well, why did she have to do that? She didn't need to tell that part of the story. Well, why not tell that part of the story? He had mistresses. He was still one of the greatest living heroes, American heroes of all time. Just as Thomas Jefferson was, even though he fathered children with his slave. These people were humans. And we should be able to see them in their full humanity and still celebrate them for their contributions. And so I think as we think about trauma, Rachel, there is a difference. So for me, when we examine the history of the 5 sort of prototypical projects that you studied, the example of J. Marion Sims for me was one that I simply could not bear. The fact that this father of gynecology used slave women and obviously involuntarily in the ways that he did, and as was later uncovered, took credit for discoveries that were in fact not undertaken by him, to my mind, represented the kind of monument, certainly such a large monument in Central Park, across the street from the Academy of Medicine. I didn't believe that that monument should remain. And so I think that there are ways in which we do have to address trauma and in the public space. And it's a painful thing to engage in because the realities of life for people whose lives were destroyed is something you come to grips with.
Yeah, so it seems like part of what's being considered is just the inherent complexity of these figures, and when is it, in some cases, every case will be so specific, but in some cases, the complexity of this figure, we can get in there, we can work with that, we can learn from this human life, and it becomes teachable. And then in other cases, like with J. Marion Sims, that learning opportunity, that sort of chance to get in there with that complexity, it's maybe not as much worth it, or it's no longer tolerable given just the sort of historic brutality of certain actions. Yeah.
I think that's right, and I think we have to also remember that the remit of the commission was also to look ahead. Because one of the things that we need to do in this city is to erect the kinds of monuments and markers of peoples whose narratives have been marginalized. Because one of the things you realize when you look at the inventory of monuments and markers in the city is that so much of it is about power. It's no surprise that there are far more monuments and markers to men than women, to white men than all others, to particular classes of people. There weren't many monuments to Jewish people that represented their narratives. There were practically no monuments, really, in any meaningful number of the narratives of African Americans, of Latinos. And most importantly, in my view, there is nothing that appropriately marks the legacy of Native Americans who occupied this island, this city. And one of the things that came out of this process was to speak with the mayor about allocating resources for new markers and monuments. And I was pleased that the mayor took the opportunity to allocate from the current budget $8 million. The city council is interested in going further. And so we are in conversations about how to have the resources, and that there is a task force that is looking at the peoples who should be represented and specific stories. And so I'm really excited about looking forward. As we are doing in another project I'm working on, I'm co-chairing with Felicia Rashad, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has created the African American Heritage Action Fund, which we chair. And that effort is really about nationally recognizing that we have underinvested in the places and stories of African Americans who have contributed to this country. And I'm really excited. We've already raised something like $8 million for this, and we're just getting started, so I'm looking forward to good things to come from that.
Yeah, well, we've been talking about sort of wrestling with the past, but you just reminded me the most exciting part of this process, this whole thing that we're doing, is that we will make new monuments, and we'll build new monuments. And thinking back to what we were first talking about with questions, and I just love that you brought up, in terms of certain Confederate monuments in South, is the very essential question, so simple: when were they built? And how that can say so much about who had power then, and what were they using that power to uphold, or to valorize, or to glorify. Turning that question around, we can think, who can we give the power to create a monument today, or who has the power right now to make a monument today that reflects our values? So that's the forward-looking, and I think the most exciting part of this whole conversation. So I hope to stay in the city and see what new monuments.
Yes, you have to stay in the city.
Yeah.
You can't go to some other museum and direct their education program, can she, Ian? No, you can't, Rachel.
Okay, I'll stay. Yeah, thinking about other sort of forward trajectories, I took great interest in the fact that one of the possibilities for monuments is that they be relocated, moved into museums, cultural institutions, galleries, and for me, as someone who works in museum, that raises the question of what is possible, what becomes newly possible when we encounter works of art, public art, monuments, in the setting of a museum. What is different about that experience, and what opportunities does it afford visitors and educators? And I think about this especially salient because of our current special exhibition of Canovas' George Washington, which shows the George Washington dressed in sort of this fantastic ancient Roman costume. It'll be open for a viewing after this conversation, actually.
You've got to see it. It's a great exhibition.
Yeah. What do museums do for the way we see monuments?
Well, I do think that there is an opportunity for curation that does not exist when it's out in the acreage. I mean, there is an opportunity to tell a story in a context, and to do that critically, I believe. So I actually see opportunity to reach even more people, because we all know that in the busy sort of ho-hum of walking through Central Park, or I live on Madison Square Park, I mean, I do from time to time stand while I'm walking the dog in front of the William Seward sort of statue there. But, for the most part, whereas when you're in a museum, you stop and you really engage with the object. And so the curation and presentation of that is really, really important. And the other thing about being in a museum is the actual care is just better than it is when it's just, really out in the park or in a public space. I will say that as Southerners, one of the things, and not to let places like New York off the hook, because there is much to be examined in places in the North. But one of the real challenges has been the degree to which a segment of society has gone to ensure that we aren't able to think critically. I was just in Montgomery, Alabama for the opening of the National Memorial to Peace and Justice, the lynching memorial that Bryan Stevenson has built there. And Bryan told me that as news of this memorial started to spread in the community, that the Alabama legislature passed a law that prohibits the taking down of any Confederate artifact. And that was an interesting data point, because it is the challenge of, and the resistance to truth that is so built into our culture and so difficult to overcome. I don't want to pick on Alabama, but this is the same state that when the federal government passed a bill creating Martin Luther King's holiday, the state, which had no Robert E. Lee holiday, passed an ordinance to make Robert E. Lee holiday the same day as Martin Luther King's. So only in the state of Alabama, it is Robert E. Lee / Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. And it is just simply, this is not me, haughty, snooty New Yorker talking about, people down there. It is about our ability to really think critically about our way of life, our identity, who we are and who we want to be. And so at the same time that this opened, this museum opened, I got to see, literally thousands of people, white people, lined up to walk into this temple on the horrors of lynching. And people were hungry to engage with that truth. And so that, to me, is the paradox of who we are as a people. Because I do believe that actually most of us want to engage, especially today, with truth and with facts. And the truths and facts of our history, facing them head on, is part of the way in which we will be liberated from the dark parts of that history.
Yeah, I love hearing that word liberated because, thinking about, maybe the idea, they're taking away monuments, it's not punitive, but we're hoping it is liberatory for many people, for all of us, really.
Absolutely. Should we take questions?
Yeah, let's open it up.
Let's do that.
So we can open this up into a broader conversation. Persephone and Vince are coming around with mics. Yeah. Right there.
I just wondered if you examined the whole idea of making monuments and building statues as a fundamentally flawed idea in the first place.
That's a great question. We had an extended conversation of the representation, the ideology of monuments as being a representation of power, of privilege, of conquering people, of war. I think where we landed is the right balance, which is to say that we do believe that there are people whose stories should be valorized and should be lifted up. Whether that needs to be on a 10-foot plinth or not is a different story, but there was a proposal on the table that we would prohibit the building, the erection of monuments that were 3 feet or more off the ground, for example. And the commission rejected that idea, in part because we do believe that as flawed as the system is, the notion of representing people, stories, ideas that we should look up to was something we believe the city could still benefit from.
Yes.
The gentleman there?
One of the decisions that we made on the commission. Hi.
Speaking of commission, a commissioner is among us. She has the microphone. Watch out, people. I know this woman. She's really good.
One of the decisions we made that kind of addressed one of the issues that you raised was how do we keep some trace of the monuments in our midst at the same time that we want to remove those that we feel are really no longer appropriate. So one of the decisions that we made was to leave the base, that Dr. Sims was resting on, even though the decision was made to move him to Greenwood Cemetery. And I'm wondering how that decision now seems to you, because it does create certain practical problems in terms of what should be there instead. Sorry. I really
No, don't
wanted
be
to
sorry.
know.
I wanted the
really
whole thing
wanted to know.
removed, as you remember.
Yes,
but we
I
won't
know.
go there right now because I lost out on that one. But let's just say that it does present a challenge to have, a 3 by 13 slab of marble with nothing on it in a park. Across from the New York Academy of Medicine. I know there were suggestions that I believe will be taken up. For example, one suggestion was to erect a memorial to the women who had been his victims. And so there were a number of ideas, suggestions like this that will be taken up going forward by the city's design and construction, design, development, and construction agency, which oversees and has responsibility for all of the public monuments and markers.
Yes.
To the degree that you cannot remove some monuments for now, isn't it a good idea to try to recontextualize the monuments that do exist? For example, I'm thinking of like temporary exhibitions, something that's put up in contrast. I'm thinking about the little girl and the bull down by Wall Street. Something that sort of captures the attention of the people who walk by these monuments, probably 80% of whom don't even know the monuments are there and don't spend much time. So a teachable way, it seems to me, is to recontextualize that. And, is that sort of something that the city can't do or doesn't want to spend the money, or does it bring up too many, difficult kinds of debates about what should be there?
No, in fact, that was one of our recommendations, that we should contextualize particularly those contested monuments, and that the city, through its DDC office, should do that, and that there should be a process for determining which of the city's markers and memorials would benefit from that kind of contextualization. And we studied other cities where this kind of a program has been implemented, so it is completely doable. Oh, sorry. Microphone. We want to hear you.
Say that New York is a place where freedoms have been enjoyed as a northern state, freedoms that aren't enjoyed in the South, and we're known for that and to celebrate that. And I had an acting teacher with a place on 13th Street, and she had was trying to get landmark status because it was a safe house for slaves on the Freedom Trail. I wondered if there are other places like that that could be memorialized. And the idea of, that we were safe houses and protected folks, coming to the North for freedom.
That's a really great question and observation, because in fact, there have been many recognitions, acknowledgments of the Underground Railroad, for example. And one of the remits of this new action fund is going to be to really have an inventory of those places and spaces such as this. I mean, one of the ways a nation tells its story is by what it officially marks. And as many of you know, in the United States, to be an official historic site, you have to be on the Department of Interior registry. And getting on the registry is a process. Currently, the registry has less than 15% of the places, markers, represent people of color and women, less than 15%. And so one of the things we have to do is to get more representation on our official national registry. And so that's underway, and again, many local historical societies are doing exactly what you just suggested, where they are taking it upon themselves to start the registration progress with the Department of Interior. And then, of course, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has a major program on this in Washington.
How about immediately to your right? Right there.
I'm going to scream. No, hello. I was just testing the mic and having fun. It's Friday, hey?
Exactly.
Two things. You have this movement figuring out the narrative. How is that going to be promoted? For example, we went to Philadelphia, and one of the things I was blown away by was the public buses promote the history of that area. Here we promote advertising, whoever pays the biggest bucks, so maybe that's something that should come up in conversation. But then the other thing too, so you have that issue, and then whenever something sensitive happens, like 9/11, huge blow up when a segment of society wanted a black fireman along with the others, and so how does that get addressed as well? So part of the promotion and part of the diversity and the backlash with that.
Well, I think it's one of the things, first of all, I think your point about Philadelphia, it's so true, of course, because in Philadelphia, history is their brand. I mean, and part of what we know about Philadelphia and that they promote very well is their history, which is one of the reasons so many people go there. We have a lot of history, too, in New York that we don't do a good enough job promoting, as you say. I think the issue of the diversity in this city is one of, again, I'm very lucky because in my job at Ford, I get to travel the world, and it's really remarkable. But I will say that there is something quite special about New York in this regard, that we, in spite of the real challenges that can come from diversity, we know that we're a better city because we are diverse. And that is in our DNA in this city. And yes, it is true, there are kerfuffles and dust-ups about all sorts of things. And we have the manifestation of tribalism, of course. But on the whole, I think the ethos of this city makes it possible for all of us to be embraced. And when there are those occasions that are clearly where racism, where anti-Semitism, where the kinds of isms that do manifest, I think in the general population, there's not tolerance for that in this city, and it's one of the reasons I live here.
Yes.
The microphone goes to Barbara Fleischman. Hi, Barbara.
Do you think that there's any reality for in the long haul to take some of those monuments, which are ultimately works of art, and place them in the appropriate places for works of art, such as city museums or city halls, with the appropriate history, which will become ultimately a very, very good teaching device for the younger generation to understand what really happened? Do you think that's a reality?
It is, and it is in fact happening in some places. I mean, in South Carolina, that's what Governor Haley did when she ordered them to be, and what I saw when I was there was there was absolutely a more critical look at those statues and what they represented, and a more balanced narrative. I mean, there was no narrative other than the narrative of, Robert E. Lee up, 20 feet above your head looking down. And that was all you needed to know what the narrative was. And so I do think that we are already demonstrating that this is possible. It's the resistance to that, because what will come with that is exactly what you said, which is, historians, curators taking that object and actually telling the story associated with it. But it is totally doable, and we're already seeing it.
Over here.
Thank you. You've mentioned the conversation that you and your fellow commissioners had around the Marion Sims sculpture and also the Columbus sculpture, and I was curious if you could share a little bit of your thinking about the Theodore Roosevelt sculpture in front of the Museum of Natural History with the two men, the man of African descent and the indigenous man striding alongside the horse that Teddy Roosevelt is riding upon.
Yes. You can give her the microphone.
Harriet? Okay.
I will say in all candor that that was probably the most contested conversation, because the sculpture in question was by one of the 20th century's great sculptors. It's a work of art. The representation of people of African descent and of Native Americans is not one that I'm particularly comfortable with. And the issue of exactly who owns the statue it was also whether it was actually owned by the state of New York, which commissioned it, because this issue had never really been resolved. And there really was no reason to resolve it until it became a contested public issue. And I believe that there will be an ongoing conversation about that particular statue.
Yes, just there. Oh, I'm sorry. How about right there in the stripes and then in the place?
Thank you very much for this thought-provoking conversation. I came to this lecture originally because I was interested in the audio descriptions for people with blindness and low vision. And I was standing on the wait line with a gentleman who said, no, that's not what it's about. It's about removing statues that don't reflect our values anymore. And I thought to myself, yes, how does a parent bring a child to perhaps the Sims statue and without it being an upsetting experience? And I wondered if perhaps there could be several statues with different perspectives. One of, I don't know the history well enough to give good examples, but one perhaps of Washington, who in his will freed the slaves, Jefferson, who felt he would prolong slavery, if I'm accurate, I'm not totally accurate on that, and then someone like Harriet Tubman, so that people have acted differently as we move forward to create a different narrative, and that we can all make decisions that we feel are important. And I think that's particularly important in the climate of today, where it seems that so many people in the government are kind of going along rather than being able to make a decision and go off in a different direction.
Well, I think that the issue of interpretation and reinterpretation is the core issue. And, you know, I think back on the narrative of Thomas Jefferson, as you mentioned, and how it has evolved. And I don't believe that Thomas Jefferson has been diminished because the truth was revealed about him. I mean, in fact, I am going to Monticello next weekend. The Ford Foundation supported the first reunion of the Hemings family at Monticello over a decade ago. And we did that in part because we believe that their narrative is a part of the Jefferson narrative. And just as the Jefferson Society, which are the heirs of Thomas Jefferson, meet at Monticello, the Hemings are the heirs as well. And so the opportunity to, at Monticello, continually reinterpret and update the narrative based on truth is the objective. We don't need different statues we just need to tell the truth. And again, the real challenge is how hard it is. Just think about how strong the sentiment was against the idea that Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings. And the almost entire American historical academic community, for the most part, were in denial as well. And ultimately, when technology made it possible for us to know incontrovertibly that the Hemings heirs have the same DNA as the Jefferson heirs, that his narrative is fuller. And it'll be much more fun to be in Monticello and not have this cloud hanging over, and for Monticello, they have now restored Sally's private area in the house because she had a private area in the house that until a few years ago was basically storage space. And so now they have brought to life, with the resources of a lot of Southerners, by the way, Sally's narrative at Monticello. And so when you visit Monticello now, you see the fullness of Jefferson's life. Because just down the hall was Sally's room. And so from my standpoint, I celebrate that. I regret and occasionally feel rage about what happened to the descendants, to those Africans who were enslaved. But I feel better because her humanity has been given light, and we all face up to it. And their shared life has been given light. And I think the experience of learning the history of Monticello will be far richer now.
Right here. Didn't you have your hand up before?
I wonder if you could comment, it's not really a New York specific issue, but our statues are a bit more heterodox in the sense that they represent all kinds of constituencies. So dealing with that is a little bit easier than when one looks down south and you have, in effect, a single narrative that is embedded, as you spoke earlier about, throughout many facets of society. And that was a very deep and hard-fought struggle, and certainly the views in the North at the time and for some period afterward would have characterized those people as traitors, which is clearly a different narrative than the one that one sees today if one goes down south. Do you have thoughts about the way forward when something is so deeply embedded?
Well, I think, the good news is that there are people of goodwill in every community, and we should never paint a narrative that generalizes any state, any population of people. And so I actually believe that there are people who will be courageous in the face of this kind of racism or whatever the ism may be. And so you can call me naive, but I am actually hopeful, based on history, that there are courageous people who will stand up and who will demonstrate a way forward and a way out.
I'm just checking in. How many more questions should we do?
Oh,
One
my
or
goodness.
two? Or?
Oh, it's gone past. Oh, all right.
We
Well, we
are-
can have a couple more. Sure.
How about a-
Is that okay?
How about two more?
I think this lady here. had
Yes,
her
right
hand
here.
up. Yes, yes, ma'am. Wait for the microphone, ma'am.
Very, very interesting, very cogent presentation. I am a descendant of Robert Morris. I guarantee you that 99 out of 100 Americans have no idea who this gentleman from Philadelphia was, have no idea that he was bailed out of bankrupt prison by Thomas Jefferson because he put so much of his money into financing the revolution. And I've long since given up trying to explain who or what he was in the history of this country. But in your position as educators, everyone here who is an educator should remember something that occurred some years ago when Gil Grosvenor announced the findings of the National Geographic's annual history and geography report. Among the findings, a majority of people, these were high school seniors who took the test, stated that Jesus Christ was born in the 16th century AD. That was good. That the American Civil War started in 1914. Remember, this is the majority of people answering the questions. And my favorite was that Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were a famous vaudeville dance team of the 1920s. Now, I am an old dame, and of course, my opinion doesn't matter in this society, except to say that I am continually stunned by the lack of a knowledge of our history throughout all levels of education, race, everything else. Would you comment, everyone?
Sure. I think that your admonition that what we all know to be true, which is that in order to know your future, you've got to know your history. And I think it is very alarming in this country, the ignorance of our history and the ways in which we have allowed ourselves to not engage, particularly in the things that we think don't relate to our lives. And it's one of the things that I think about, I don't know you, Rachel, as an African American, I am so grateful that I now and children now get to learn about African American history. I learned nothing in public schools in Texas. I had to, there was mandatory Texas history. And so I got to learn about the Alamo. But they didn't tell us that there were Mexicans at the Alamo. On our side, on the side of Texans. There was a narrative that was about the Alamo that was not based in fact. And so I'm grateful that I now know more about African American history. I think the challenge and the opportunity is for us, through our teaching and through our cultural practice, to recognize that we all have identities and that we need to know about our own identities, that strengthens us individually and collectively our communities, but that we also have a common shared identity as Americans that is also important for us to know. And I sometimes do worry that in our pursuit to make sure that we learn the history of specific histories, specific cultures, that we not lose the importance, the centrality of learning about our common humanity, our common heritage, that sometimes I worry that we don't lift that up enough.
Just one more question, I think, right here. Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to share a little bit of good news and also an invitation. Some of us are here today from the Stanton and Anthony Statue Fund, and we have been working for a number of years to break the bronze ceiling in Central Park to create the first statue of real women in the 164-year history of that park. We have been approved for that project.
Thank you so much, Darren, and thanks to all of you for being part of this
Thank you,
conversation.
Rachel. This has been such a treat for me. Thank you.